all of this though goes back to I want to talk about this conflict that
Okay.
I have, because on one hand we're told like peacemakers, heed them not, turn the other cheek, and then you also have scriptures that say things like this. I'll pull it up on the screen real quick. Don't we get a message that says don't be contentious, and then we read a scripture that says contend thou therefore morning by morning, day after day, let thy warning voice go forth. Right? We look at Jude says the same thing, contend for the faith. We're to warn the people, and it becometh every man to warn his neighbor. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Thoughtful Faith Show. Today, I am joined by a friend of mine, Zachary Wright. Zachary, welcome to the show.
Thanks for letting me on, Jacob.
Awesome. Well, hey, just real quick, if you want to give people a little bit about who you are and maybe why you wanted to come on this show today, I'd appreciate that. Tell people who you are.
Sure. So as mentioned before, I'm Zach Wright. I typically introduce myself as I try not to be Zach wrong, something like that. I'm into that kind of a cheesy humor, admittedly, but I am a returned missionary. I have cursorily been associated with a lot of different apologetic endeavors. I have done several Fair has been kind enough. Fair LDS has been kind enough to allow me to use their platform to do a couple of podcasts. I've done a couple of different interviews and discussions with some mutual friends of ours, including but not limited to Robert Boylan.
Love Robert.
Awesome. He's great. We've done a couple of things. One was me doing some responses to Bill Reel, and another one was kind of both of us talking about our interactions with the Gospel for Mormons pamphlet, which if I remember correctly, you've done some work on that, like responding to Jeff Durbin.
Jeff Durbin's. I did a response video to the Gospel for Mormons, and he actually made a response to it, which was kind of fun.
That's right. I forgot about that, but you're right. I think I watched bits and pieces of that, admittedly, but basically the long and the short of it is I'm deeply invested in looking more deeply into faith and looking more deeply into my faith. And I have been very impressed so far with how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has been able to foster like a good life for me, but also be able to withstand immense amounts of scrutiny.
Yeah.
And that would be my view, and that would be my argument. And as I've talked with people about it, I hope to be able to learn more about it myself, and also just kind of have great conversations about what it means to believe, like what we believe, why we believe it. And it's just great all around. And I like this world that I'm slowly stepping into.
Cool. And that's actually kind of what I wanted to talk to you today. I know we've had some other stuff that we want to get into, but I wanted to first have a conversation with you about sort of apologetics generally.
Okay.
Because as I look at kind of the apologetic world in the church, now you're associated with FAIR, but we had talked a little beforehand. Just so everybody knows, Zachary is not a representative of FAIR. So just don't think that he speaks authoritatively. He's just giving his personal opinion on things in this discussion. But I'm actually a big fan of FAIR. FAIR has been a big resource to me as I've had questions and wanted to see I look at FAIR in my mind as sort of the repository of defensive arguments. When you come across an attack on the church, FAIR will have good sort of apologetics laid out to sort of provide an answer to criticisms and attacks that are common to Latter-day Saints. And I think that that's great. I think that I always say that I feel like FAIR plays defense, right? And they're good at playing defense. I just wonder if you look, a lot of times I feel like the apologetic landscape generally is filled with people like our friend Jeff Durbin and others attacking us, and then us playing this defensive role of kind of like, well, they're shooting at us, we're going to dodge all the bullets, right? And to a certain extent, that's necessary. That's good. Like, I'm glad that we have that.
I know I don't want to get shot.
I know, neither do I. But at some point, do we have the need for shooting back? And Latter-day Saints often feel kind of like, well, let's be peacemakers and all that. And I agree to a large extent. But I mean, I don't know. Just give me your thoughts on that so far. Do you have any feelings about sort of a more offensively oriented apologetic?
I can see where you're coming from, and I've thought about this too. And I want to make sure that I give your question here its due diligence, because on one hand, I'm inclined to agree with you. From the very beginnings of our church, we have a history of being attacked. Like the very first anti-Mormon publication, is my understanding, was Mormonism Unveiled, less than 5 years after the church was first established.
Yeah.
Reestablished. But I can definitely see where you're coming from, where members of the church we have a culture of wanting to be polite. And it stems from a desire to be kind. It stems from a desire to be Christ-like.
Agreed.
And I fully get behind that. I mean, I don't consider myself to be a very maybe aggressive isn't the right word, but I don't consider myself to be somebody who likes starting unnecessary conflict. But at the same time, one of the main reasons I started getting into this discussion is because as I was learning more and more about what people were saying about the church, I was realizing that there was a lot of misinformation that was being spread.
Yeah.
And it maybe not all of it, but it was a significant enough amount to where I felt it was necessary to step in. And to an extent, there's a part of me that very openly agrees that sort of thing needs to be addressed. And I have no problem putting myself in the line of fire when it comes to being able to address misinformation. And one of the things I appreciate about you is that you try to structure the conversation in terms of truth. And I can respect that. And I think that plays into what I'm describing here. But I don't mean to interrupt. Were you about to say something?
Oh, no, I was just going to say that yes, I just wonder if, again, the orientation that you're giving there is more defensive. Now, I look at, and I don't have, like I said, you have to have a good defense, right? Like I look at, it's like if we're a football team, I look at fair as like our defense. And we got some good linebackers in there, man. They can make good hits. They can hold the line pretty good. But at best, what they're doing is they're holding the line, right? I think when I look at the history of our apologetics, especially when I go back into the era when the church had its highest growth rates, if you look back, especially into, go read The Key to the Science of Theology by Parley P. Pratt. And that is not a defensive, apologetic. That is a very much, we're going into the world and we're proclaiming to the world that there's something new going on. And if you think about the orientation of a prophet of God is to call the world to repentance, right?
That's certainly how it's portrayed in the Book of Mormon.
Certainly. And I'm not saying that, but I think that the conversation, I don't think you can make the case that you don't need to have an offense on the field. It's like all we do is play defense, right? I think you need an offense and a defense, but I think there is a legitimate question about what is the appropriate offense, because it's very easy. Like we don't want to go and be Jeff Durbin. Like Jeff Durbin is not that ain't our style of offense. No. But at the same time, the question then becomes, well, what is? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Honestly, as I've thought about it, the best offense in that regard is acknowledging that there is a truth and that the church is trying to collect all of it. Mm-hmm. And as we collect all of it, we want to share that with other people. That's actually one of the reasons I wanted to serve a mission. I served during COVID, which was a fun story. Yeah, but
a lot to that.
I've talked about that in other venues, so I'll spare you the details there. But as I began studying the LDS theology, I began to realize more and more just how much of it was really just a repository of truth. And I agree with you. There's an aspect of our faith that invites us to, as Jude says, contend for the faith. and also be able to share that. And as missionary, it's really easy because you're doing that every single day. And if you're serving in the South like I did, then heaven knows you're going to have a lot of opportunity to do that.
And it's funny because I'm the first one to say, like, don't go and quote unquote Bible bash with people. Like anyone who's a Latter-day Saint, like it doesn't work. Like that's sort of you oftentimes you entrench someone more when you get into some sort of a battle with them. But it's funny because I've realized that, but on the same token, like, is there any realm where a debate could actually be helpful? Right?
I've thought about that. I remain unconvinced either way. Like on one hand, I acknowledge like there's a purpose that debates serve, but on the other hand, honestly, it's like there was a really great analogy I had, and it just escaped me. You'll have to forgive me, but there's a part of me that thinks that if you're already planning on having a debate, there's something has already failed in terms of somebody being able to understand truth. And I also have to openly acknowledge the idea that there's a lot about faith that is kind of personal and subjective. And it's hard for me to be able to communicate because a lot of, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later, but a lot of our most powerful spiritual experiences are based on intuition. And it's really hard to levy that in an offensive way other than what the church recommends, sharing your experiences and also being able to share truth, because testimony at its core is really hypothetically just the spirit testifying of truth.
Yes.
And so going back to your point though, I do like the idea of being able to initiate instead of us just waiting for people to come to attack us, because heaven knows we've been doing that for a long time. And so one of the ways I do that instead is I prompt discussions via questions. My offensive strategy is offensive, if we can really call it that, is question asking, where I will, I would start by bringing up to people, okay, who is God? And why do you esteem, the Bible to be authoritative? And essentially flip the conversations on their head to where people have to start thinking about this sort of thing for themselves. And it is my hope that as I do that in a Christ-like way, and I use the term Christ-like very deliberately there, in the sense that Christ ministers to people according to their needs. And, sometimes that means speaking more harshly than others. But my hope is that as I ask questions and as I bring up truth in this kind of direct way, which Latter-day Saints may or may not be used to, that the Spirit will then be able to foster a change. And so on one hand, I'm honestly, there's a part of me that's a little bit conflicted, because on one hand, I really value the idea of meeting people where they're at. I don't like the idea of initiating conflict where I esteem it to be unnecessary, because to an extent, we also claim the privilege of worshiping the Almighty God according to the dictates of our conscience and allowing all men the same privilege.
So it's funny. Yeah, it's funny because the being conflicted over this, like, yes, 100%. That's sort of like almost why I bring this up. If you feel like this is kind of a tough thing to like sort of sort through, it's because it is. And I've really struggled with it too. When I formed my channel, one of the things is once people started actually listening to me, I was kind of like, oh crap. Like I gotta be serious about this now, because people like actually are listening. And so I gotta like put together a mission statement, and I gotta really be clear, like, why am I doing this? What's the ethos? What is my channel all about?
How big is your channel now?
I'm up to about 17,000 subscribers, and I'm getting so we did a really, the guys with Ward Radio did a really interesting thing where they pulled the data on all of the Latter-day Saint channels. Jonah Barnes did. They need to do an episode about it, actually. And basically like everything from like BYU TV to like the church news to like every possible channel, and all the anti-Mormon ones as well. And then he ranked them in order of views. And what's funny is that I think for instance, Word Radio, they are in the top like 3 of faithful Latter-day Saint like content creation channels that are actually getting views.
I believe that.
Okay. Yeah. And here's what's wild. I'm sort of like, okay, hold on a second. Hold on. Why are they getting so many views? And then I'm also going and looking at like, and there are other channels out there that literally have like hundreds of thousands of subscribers that are getting way less views than Word Radio, you know? And you go, wait a minute. Why, like, what's going on here? Now, Word Radio, I can talk about the things I love about Word Radio, which there's a lot to love.
I was going to say, I Word Radio, when they bring buddies like, you know, buddies of mine like Don Bradley on there, I'm like, ooh, yes, that's awesome. I love every aspect of that. And then they
go off the rails.
No,
I agree. And the thing is I think you have to accept Word Radio for what it is and know what it is and what it isn't. I think sometimes that's something that I have, but they're obviously they're part of this landscape. Regardless, people are listening to them, right? And something is working there, and people need to pay attention to that. And I actually found that I was much higher than I expected in the actual views that I'm getting, especially with the amount of content that I put. They put out a lot more, but there are other channels that are out there that just don't get that many views each month, even though they have a lot of subscribers. And that says something about relevance. Like who are people actually listening to, right? Just because you subscribed to something, 3 years ago or 5 years ago or something, like you don't care about their content. You watched a couple videos, thought they were all right. So all of this though goes back to, I want to talk about this conflict that I have, because on one hand, we're told like peacemakers, heed them not, turn the other cheek. And then you also have scriptures that, say things like this. I'll pull it up on the screen real quick.
Sure.
Because I have them on my channel, on my About page, Doctrine and Covenants. What is this? 112:5. And it's funny, Elder Holland just quoted this, and he said that this is what in his near-death experience that he, like, the Lord told him, was basically repeating this verse, which is, don't we get a message that says, don't be contentious. And then we read a scripture that says, contend thou therefore morning by morning, day after day, let thy warning voice go forth. Right. We look at Jude says the same thing, contend for the faith. We're to warn the people, and it becometh every man to warn his neighbor. There is this mixed signal between be the peacemaker, and then on the other side, we have the hymn, go listen to Hope of Israel. It's like, we'll take the sword and cut down the foe, right? And you're kind of like, wait a minute, I'm getting like a mixed signal here. Now, I've tried to figure out, like, how do I reconcile this, right? This apparent contradiction. And to put another scripture on the thing, I have an ethos that's hard on ideas, but soft on people. Okay. Jesus said, behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Right. And so I've tried to adopt that as my thing. Now, I also make a distinction to try and reconcile this between what I call kind of direct ministry versus public advocacy. Okay.
I've heard you talk about that a couple of times.
And maybe, and just to give people the quick summary, it's, if I'm doing a public debate, like I'm going to be doing with Trent Horn, who's a very, very well-known Catholic apologist, like
we'll talk about that today. There's a couple of things I wanted to talk with you about that specifically.
Right. Well, then let's
go on. Yeah.
But I just want to say that there's this orientation of, well, when do we pull out the sword and go to battle? In my mind, when I'm going with Trent Horn, first of all, Trent and I know that we are doing this voluntarily. We are not enemies. We are very clear that this is not to be personal, but we are going to have a battle of ideas. I think of it a lot like, an MMA fight. Two guys get in the ring and they're going to punch each other in the face. They're going to go after it, but then they're going to get up and they're going to hug each other. Because at the end of the day, this was about something that wasn't personal, like out of hatred. It was about seeing which one was going to win in the battlefield of ideas. And the only reason I have a soft spot in my heart for debate, twofold. Number one, because it helps save my testimony. because watching debates of atheists, the famous atheists against the Christian apologists, I came to realize, like, wow, I didn't realize there was this world of Christian thought that was as profound as it was, especially when it came to atheism, which is something that the church doesn't really deal with, I think, very well. And then on the other hand, it also gets you out of an echo chamber. Like, if I'm just listening to one side talk, or even if I go and listen to the other side in their echo chamber, it's like, there's a big difference when you say, okay, you have ideas, you have claims, they have claims. Well, what if we put you together in a room and you try and hash it out to see who actually has arguments that actually work? And I say in the world of apologetics that, sorry if I'm on kind of a rant here, but you bring up the subjective, and I agree with you that spiritual experience is ultimately the basis of our testimony, the deep thing.
By necessity, it has to be.
Yes, agreed. I mean, if you are a Christian, let alone a Latter-day Saint, the Spirit of God has to be the foundation of your belief in God and your faith. But apologetics is not that. That's not the world of apologetics. Apologetics is the world of argument. It's the world of rational defense of faith. And so if we are going to operate in the world of apologetics, then we have to have good arguments, because if you can't show that you can defend your ideas rationally, then your faith is irrational. And there's no rational basis for Mormonism. And then what you do is you end up in a situation where we don't have a rational case for our faith. We just have a subjective experience that we say trumps any rational arguments, right? And so apologetics exists in my mind in the world of do we have a rational faith, or are we an irrational faith? Sorry, I kind of ranted there, but that's my view of the apologetic sort of landscape.
All right, so here's the deal. I'm going to complicate what you said, and then I'm going to agree with you. But sit tight here with me for a second.
Sounds good.
So you bring up you bring up how the early church saw lots of growth, and I think you went on Word Radio, and I think you talked a little bit about this too, where you look at like examples like the Pratt brothers, who are going out. I've read the autobiography of Parley P. Pratt. I think I read it on my mission or shortly thereafter, and it was very interesting. Like it was cool to like watch, the miracles that he's seen, and also some of his strategies as he was talking with people. And he took a very much a forward, let me address your ideas and show why my ideas are better kind of approach. And that certainly does have merit, but every single approach, I think, has its own consequences as well.
Agreed.
And so, for example, I mean, religious violence was the highest it had ever been, is my understanding, back in the 1800s, because of the kind of fiery rhetoric that they was using. Like, go back and listen to the Salt Sermon by Sidney Rigdon. That's an excellent example. And there are certainly instances wherein I think that the cultural rhetoric did just as much to kind of make some situations worse as it did to foster those kinds of discussions. So I agree with you. And so in my mind,
you have to be careful. I wouldn't necessarily, I think there are good lessons to learn about what they did, but I also would say there's probably some cautionary tales in there as well.
Yes. That's exactly my point. So my approach is you have to bring the right tools for the right job. And you have to understand, if we're talking about approaches, which I think you are, about bringing these topics up, if we're looking at kind of the way Christ was speaking to the woman at the well, as opposed to the way Christ would speak to the Pharisees, if we look at those as two different tools.
And I would call that a difference between a direct ministry approach with an individual versus a public engagement approach, where it's not about the person across from you necessarily, it's about the truth in the culture generally. But that's kind of the way I distinct that. But I think that lines up with that public versus private sort of framing of things.
And that may very well be the theme for tonight, where we're saying the exact same thing different ways. But my point is that we need to be willing to accept the consequences of the approach we employ. And so if we are engaging in what you would call private ministry. I'm still not fully sold on the verbiage on that, but it could just be that I haven't listened to you enough to be able to fully comment on that. But if I engage in this private ministry as you describe, I have to be willing to accept the idea that maybe this might form more meaningful connections I have with the individual. But
Absolutely.
you know, in the same sense that like Mormon or Moroni are talking to like the Nephites, when they don't use harsh language, they don't listen. Or
Yeah.
there's that example, and I can think back. Well, maybe if I'm too soft on them, or if I care far more about my tone and my feelings than their feelings, which you know may or may not be a bad thing, but
Yeah.
it may or may not get the message across. And you have to understand, in that sense, you have to understand the game you're playing.
Mm-hmm.
Where if you're playing the game of I want to get this idea across in a way that is going to show that bad information is not nearly as good as good information, and I'm going to use whatever rhetorical methods, be that memes, which heaven
Memes
knows
are
what
awesome.
memes. They are the DNA of the soul.
Exactly.
No.
I always say memes are just distilled truth wrapped in humor, and that when you have truth wrapped in humor, nobody can resist it.
There's probably truth to that, and there's probably a meme that could be made of that. But I want to make sure that I know what tools I am employing, and I think that if Latter-day Saints understand what their goals are, that it will be easier for them to acknowledge what tools they should use to accomplish that goal, and try to involve the Spirit as much as we possibly can while trying to accomplish those goals. Because if we can do that, I think that resolves some of the tension that you're describing, or that would be my initial thought.
So one other thing that I've been, so I'm a business person, and so my big thing is I don't really care about what people say. I would care about the results they actually produce. And so one of the things that I've been looking at, and because I've been, as much as I've been in participating in the apologetic enterprise, as it were, to some extent, I also am measuring like what actually works in apologetics. And so to a certain degree, I look at things like Ward Radio, or even my channel to a certain extent, or Greg Mattson, or others that take a more offensive stance. And I see these stories of people sending me messages saying that they've been inactive a long time and I helped them to come back to the church. I have an investigator who's about to get baptized who's going to come on and probably talk with us on Word Radio in a few weeks. And he said that our shows helped him to, in this process, to decide to get baptized. And so when I see this sort of the results, that is the thing that I guess in a way justifies the things I'm doing. I'm not saying you guys don't get those kind of messages. I'm sure that Fair and other apologetic groups, I'm sure that they do. And I believe that's really it. But I do really think that we need to look at what actually seems to work. Because in my mind, the way I look at the apologetics is that the defensive apologetics hold the line, and we need to hold the line. But to move the ball down the field, we need to be able to not only look, for instance, I have relatives who are atheists, right?
Okay.
And I need to not only be able to defend myself against their attacks, I need to be able to engage in a conversation with them about atheism to help them understand why, to warn my brother, as it were, about why this worldview actually doesn't make a lot of sense. But I need to do it in a way that is not, that isn't going to push him away, right? And I need to, and we think, okay, well, offensive apologetics, for those who doubt that it'll work. Remember that is what John DeLynn and all of these people have been doing, right? Like, they win the game by playing offense. And if you don't go back and show people why their worldview is bankrupt and what they're offering isn't good, and get specific and aggressive about the ideas, not the people. I tell people I love John DeLynn. I don't have any personal animus towards the man, but I can say that the ideas that he propagates are cancer, and I will call them cancer. And I will say that if you don't have that sort of a sword ready in the battlefield of ideas, not people, right? If you don't go and slay the bad ideas that are out there, I think that people start to think that you can't slay them and that all you can do is dodge the bullets that are being shot at you. And so my sort of, and I'm not saying that this is what I want Fair to do. I think if Fair just wants to be our defense, like, good on you, Fair. Like, play defense. You do good at it. I want more content from Fair defending against the attacks. That's great. But I also think that we as a church, just in general, and as a culture, need to look into this idea of the effectiveness of a more offensive apologetic. I don't know if that's...
No, and there's probably a degree of truth in that. I might need some more time to think about that, because I doubt that either of us are going to be able to find a way to solve this quasi 200-year-old discussion within the church, I would say.
Yeah, for sure.
But I know that as I have looked more deeply into evidences, for example, of like the Book of Mormon, as I have looked more deeply into the philosophical implications of what I think our theology, what those are, as I look at the truths that are found within the gospel, I know that it is my intention to be able to share that. And to an extent, I find sharing those truths to be my offense. And people that at that point, so for instance, there are a few different organizations out there that are hopping into the apologetics game, so to speak. So Fair has been like the predominant one for decades now.
Yep.
But now you also have Scripture Central, who's starting to hop on that bandwagon. You also have the B.H. Roberts Foundation and the Mormoner website.
Yep.
And they have their own, they all have their own, they fall somewhere on the spectrum between what I think you described as defense and offense. But as I look more deeply into these evidences, I know that I can hold on to these ideas and I can present them. And I say, okay, so how do you reconcile the Nahum in the Book of Mormon corresponding with the Nahum region in the Arabian Peninsula?
Yep.
And I can look at, I can approach things from like, okay, so how do you explain how the Book of Mormon has been able to withstand scrutiny for the past 200 years? Mm-hmm. And I look at truth as being a tool of defense as much as it is a tool of offense. And I think if I was to, ask the people who work over at Fair why they do what they do, I think that they would fall somewhere more on the spectrum, like, oh, well, you can use truth just as much to employ that. But I mean, putting yourself out there is scary, Jacob.
It is.
You of all people know that.
No, and I do. And that's why I'm not saying everybody needs to do this. I'm saying that those who have, like, I kind of look at myself and I'm sort of like, I'm an idiot. I'm not somebody special. And yet I'm the one out here like leading a charge. Like I don't need to be out here doing this. Like this should be like the church's scholars and best theologians and debaters and best communicators. Like they should be the ones out here modeling this. And here's what I say, because you're talking about truth and using truth as offense. I agree 100%. And Joseph Smith, I have it on my website, on my I'm looking at it right now on my mission statement. My mission is to contrast truth and falsehood. And I use the quote from Joseph Smith, by proving contraries, which, by the way, everyone should know, means by trying, essentially proving as in trying or trying out, or by proving different ideas, by trial between different ideas, truth becomes manifest. And he was talking specifically in that letter that he wrote this in to a guy who was writing about the histories of different religious traditions, right? And he wanted to write kind of the history of Latter-day Saints and include them in there. What Joseph was saying is that by putting in this history, sir, what you're going to do, these different contrary sort of idea groups, truth will be made manifest. Okay. And I know Jared Halverson has had a little bit of a different take on that, but I actually, if you look at the context of the letter, the letter, and I'm not against what Halverson says on that, by the way. I think he makes a valid point, but I don't think that's the proper exegesis of what Joseph Smith was actually saying in that letter. He was talking about different theological and religious worldviews being put side by side next to each other, because when you contrast things, the truth becomes more apparent. And I think one of the things that we are afraid to do, we will talk about what we believe, but we will never contrast it against false beliefs because we worry about offending people. And I think that truth becomes more clear when a diamond shines brightest against a black background. The restoration shines brightest against the great apostasy, right? It's like when you understand the truth and the falsehood, the law of chastity shines brightest when you look at all the hellish consequences that come from broken relationships and families due to a lack of chastity. And when you do these things, when you put these contraries next to each other, when you put, as Lehi might say, the opposition in all things, the good and the evil, and it shines brightly. It creates the definition. And I think so often we are so worried in our sort of culture of niceness about contrasting the falsehood with the truth, because by talking about what's sin and evil and being very specific about it, people get offended. And they're like, well, I know people that do that. And I couldn't, why are you being so judgmental? And it's like, no, we are called to judge. Go read Moroni 7. You can't judge if you don't have both.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but
no,
it's important.
You interrupt me. You do it. I want you to.
One thing I've noticed is that it's having rather devastating consequences on my generation, where I talk to people who are my age or maybe just a little bit younger than I am, and they're like, I don't know why I believe. Where they don't know positive reasons why the church is true.
Yep.
And that's a serious problem, because I look at the Spirit as being able to work through truth that we have been given. And if they don't know the truth, then to an extent, you haven't given the Spirit a lot of ways to work through that, to, provide, you don't even have the belief within you, let alone having a reason for the belief which is in you. And so it's
absolutely,
and that's a serious problem.
And I think that's what apologetics can do. It can give people the reasons. There's that Austin Farrar quote that we all should know and love, that reason and evidences don't create belief, but they create an environment in which belief can flourish. Because if you can't defend your beliefs, well, then if you don't have any good reasons to believe things, well, then why the heck do you believe them? Your beliefs are just arbitrary. You're just going with the crowd. And now you say that there's a problem with youth. I agree that we don't, like, your average 18-year-old who's going on a mission. A lot of them have like you said, why do you believe? It's like, well, I just had a feeling, and this is my church, and my parents did this. But like, there's no, and I'm not saying that isn't valid.
I was going to say, I'm not sure that's inherently wrong either.
No, it's great. It's just incomplete. In my mind, I think that there needs to be something more than just I had an experience, because other people in other faiths say I had an experience. And so what makes yours right and them wrong?
And that is a beautiful segue into tonight's discussion. I think
we'll have to definitely do that in this next episode. Just to wrap up, what do you think is how do we solve this problem of the youth, so many of the youth not having a reason for why they believe?
Interestingly enough, I talked with Blake Ostler about this. I was able to attend his kind of debate with Robert Boylan and like all the Ratio Christi people that happened at UVU. I was one of the people that got to ask questions, actually. I don't think the recording was able to get my question in there, which was sad.
Yeah.
But I talked with him after the debate, because I brought up very clearly with him, listen, I mean, this stuff is interesting, but your average 16 to 18-year-old doesn't give a crap about what John 1:1-3 says. And we can sit here and talk about, well, logos means all days till Sunday, but like, how do I get people to, have that testimony of who God is? How do I, and not only that, how do I provide that kind of reasoning so that people my own age can have that experience with God, and then consequently develop that environment within themselves to where the spirit can flourish via reason, via behavior outcome, that sort of thing. And he said something to me that at first I didn't understand, but as I've pondered about it, I think it makes more sense. He said, people believe, people will feel God manifest when you manifest God in your words and actions. And at first I was like, well, that's the cheesiest Sunday school answer I've ever heard in my life. And I mean, no disrespect to Mr. Osler. Heaven knows the man's a genius, but
yeah, and I love
it took me a while to kind of ponder about it. And it really did boil down to give them reasons, whether it is give them, scholarly articles in the same breath you give them scripture and your testimony. Give them examples of what the disciple scholar model looks like, where you are not only engaged in the emotional, intuitive work that a testimony is a part of, but also in the, I don't want to say rational, because that implies there's some kind of dichotomy between like faith and reason. I don't like that. But, also engage in the, the scholarly academic work of being able to analyze this data and come to your own conclusions about what is true. And my hope is that as I continue to discuss these things with people, it will again provide an environment, as you said, that the spirit can flourish. And if everybody could do that, if everyone would be willing to have those hard conversations with people who agree with you and with people who disagree with you, I think it would lead to a more robust faith across the board.
Yeah. Well, no, I think we could talk about this probably all night. There's all sorts of things to say about it. But I appreciate you for coming on and having this conversation. Everyone, if they want to get your information or follow some of your content, where do you suggest they go?
Sure. I mentioned earlier that I have a couple of podcasts done with Fair. I have done a critical thinking series with Fair. It's about 10 episodes. It's called By Study and By Faith. You can look it up on the Fair website or the Fair YouTube channel. It should be there. I've also done a couple of interviews with Robert Boylan. I think I mentioned that earlier. I don't have my own YouTube channel, but you'll see me around. And if you have any questions, you could reach out to me at my Fair email. I've kind of designated as being my go-to email for this sort of thing. It's zwright@fairlatterdaysaints.org. Or you can reach out to me on Facebook. And so if people want to get in touch with me, there are certainly ways.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button so my future videos show up on your feed. Also, if you or someone that you know has benefited from the content here on Thoughtful Faith, please consider becoming a channel donor or volunteer by visiting my new website, thoughtfulfaith.org, and clicking on the Get Involved page.